All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to check out important theories and discoveries, concepts that you probably are not familiar with. But if you were, they would accentuate your life in boundless ways and, things that have been suppressed out of your purview. And today is our 281st Bible Decode. We've been digging into the New Testament and looking for different ways to decode it, different ways to approach it. Now, the first is just general advice. When I listen to Christians talk about, the Bible, they're always kind of bypassing the first step. They go into the Bible and they'll cite you verses and they'll tell you different stories from the Bible, but they won't go into what the Bible actually is. Many of them would just say, this is the Word of God. Well, that's not a truther approach. I need better than that. I need more than just to tell me that it's the Word of God, because that's faith. That's what you believe. There's no evidence for that. Now, if you can show me a lot of things that are within it, maybe that lend an argument to it being divinely inspired, maybe I could come around to that. But at the point of tabula rasa, or at a beginner's level, I need more than that. And so you want to tell me, what is the Bible? Where did it come from? Who wrote it? What is the history? Why was it written? What is the point? These are the introductory questions before you even dig into the text that need to be answered. And so that's kind of where we're coming from here. And so we've been exploring the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the New Testament actually was not written by a bunch of illiterate Aramaic-speaking disciples of Jesus, but it was actually written by the highly literate and well-stocked with resources Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, from 69 until 96 AD. That is Emperor Vespasian, and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. They backdated the story of Jesus by 40 years. And the reason why they did it is because they were trying to mellow out the Jews, to tame the Jews, domesticate the Jews, to get them to stop being so militant and aggressive, and stop being such a pain in the butt for the Romans, because that's what they had been for the last 125 years. Constant uprisings, revolts, insurrections, assassinations, terrorist attacks from the Jews, because the Jews believed they were a chosen people and that they had a separate set of laws, and they just would not assimilate to the Roman Empire, more so than any other group of people under the Roman rule. And so after this war, this final war, this culminating war, the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, Vespasian and his son Titus, who were both military generals in that war, and who both were wounded in the war, executed this plan, a psychological operation to domesticate the Jews. And, you also have to remember that Vespasian, that Rome was in a civil war itself. after Emperor Nero died in 68 AD, he was assassinated, and that led to a series of assassinations. Emperor Galba was assassinated, Emperor Otho was assassinated, and Emperor Vitellius was assassinated, all within 12 months of each other. And then Vespasian got the call from the battle, on the battlefield, fighting against the Jews. He got the call to become the new emperor, and he put his son Titus in charge of the military, and he went to Rome eventually. But you got to think, in his mind, he's like, the last 4 guys have all just been assassinated. What's going to happen to me? Like, I might need to take some unorthodox efforts to shore up my position. And they're really not even very unorthodox, because the Romans, this is right in their MO. This is exactly what they would do, is come up with a psychological operation and use religion in order to do it. They had done the same thing. The Romans created a number of other religions in the 1st century. So this is not like something that is like coming out of left field. This is right down the Romans, right in their bag, right in their bag of tricks. And they took advantage of the fact that the Jews were literally waiting on a Messiah. And the Messiah that they were waiting on was a military commander that was going to help them kick out the Romans in this case, or whatever colonial power. And these are all these Old Testament prophecies for the Jewish Messiah. So they took advantage of that, and instead they proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression. And then, to throw in the other half of it, they proposed a Jesus, a Messiah, who overturned the tables of the money changers in the outer court of the temple. These are the Jewish money changers, and this is part of the Jewish temple, the Jewish religion, the Jewish rituals. He, cussed out the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the temple sacrifices. He told his Jewish followers to abandon their families to follow him. So Jesus is attacking the Jewish traditions and rituals, family structure, infrastructure, and so on, and at the same time he's being deferential to the Romans. And then Paul is doing it even more so. Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and even more anti-Jewish. Jesus talks about, in Luke 14:26, you must hate your family. You must hate your mother and hate your father if you want to follow me. So, these things should raise a red flag with critical readers, but that thing is that people who read the Bible are not critical. But you have to be, if you consider yourself a truther, you have to be on alert for psychological operations of all stripes. Now, if this was something that was written in the 21st century, you would be all up in, doing gematria and, doing research on every specific instance, every specific sentence to figure out where it came from, running it through AI to see whether it, stood the test. But when it comes from the Bible, you just give it a free pass. So we're not going to do that here. This is really just, though, the circumstantial evidence. Once you get to the direct evidence for the Roman origins hypothesis, it becomes overwhelming. Basically, there are many, many themes of parallels, but the code book that you need to unlock the code of the Bible is Josephus's War of the Jews, in 7 volumes, a history of this war that Titus and Vespasian participated in, and Josephus himself says he participated in, and Josephus admittedly was a Roman a denizen of Caesar's palace at Rome. He was an adopted family member of the Flavians. He's known as Flavius Josephus. And he was one of the court historians for the Flavian emperors. And when you look at War of the Jews with an alert eye, at the same time that you look at the Gospels, you will find undeniable proof that they were written by the same authors. So I'm not saying that Josephus was actually one person. Maybe he was a pseudonym. Maybe he was a whole army of people, or a team of people. I would suggest that that's probably true because of the level of complexity involved in this psychological operation. Some of the parallels, of which there are over 250 just in the book of Luke, are diabolically clever and also dripping with hate for the Jews, and ridicule and debauched body and denigrating and brutal and grim humor, characteristic of the Romans. And so you can see the intentionality involved. It's way beyond coincidental. Sometimes even just a single parallel goes beyond coincidental. But then when you have 250 of them, maybe you might be able to eliminate 50 of them as being coincidental. What are you going to do with the other 200? Maybe you're even able to eliminate 150 of them for being coincidental. That's a stretch, because many of the parallels are incredibly well put together, have several different motifs of parallelism. The military campaign of Titus serves as a model for the ministry of Jesus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order. They encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years in time. We're talking about over 40 separate events that are all synchronized in such a way. And there's plenty of other evidence beside that that I've gotten into in probably the previous 150, 175 videos. We also are, now that we kind of have discredited the New Testament along with Josephus as being part of a psychological operation, that creates a big vacuum in the first century, our understanding of the first century. And into that gap comes the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls are primarily written in Hebrew, whereas the Gospels and Josephus are written in Greek, which is, the Greek is one of the two main languages for the Roman Caesars, while it is much less prominent in Judea. But the Hebrew, primarily Hebrew, some Aramaic, just a tiny bit of Greek within the Dead Sea Scrolls, it points to them being much less likely to have been written by the Romans anyway. And they were discovered in the 1940s and 50s in a series of caves near Qumran, near Jerusalem. And there are all the ancient Hebrew scriptures that we know of as now the Old Testament, except for one book. Many copies of Genesis and Exodus and Isaiah, and but there's also a lot of sectarian material which is specific to the sect of monks, of very pious monks, ascetic and I can't ever remember this word. It means that you don't have sex, whatever that word is. Celibate monks that are living at Qumran, but they wrote a lot of documents, the Damascus document, the War Scroll, the Temple Scroll, the Community Rule, and things like that, that kind of lay out what their ground rules are at their monastery, you know, what they value, what's important to them. And they talk a lot about a teacher of righteousness. And then they also talk about a wicked priest. And they talk about the liar. And a lot of scholars have tried to link those three characters in that narrative to biblical times, into the Gospels. You know, who is the teacher of righteousness? Well, you probably think it's Jesus, but this author that we're talking, that we're going to read from here, Robert Eisenman, thinks it was Jesus' brother, James. And others think that it was John the Baptist. And then some people think that Jesus was actually the liar. And some people think that Paul was the liar. So, you know, these are questions that the Dead Sea Scrolls are very relevant to a study of the Gospels. Whether you think that they are real or not. And whether you think that the Dead Sea Scrolls are real or not. I mean, that could be part of a psyop too, because they were discovered just 2 years after the Nag Hammadi documents, the Gnostic Gospels, were discovered in Egypt in 1945. And it's kind of like the same narrative. These Bedouins, you know, found, you know, illiterate Bedouin nomads found these documents and didn't know what they were, and they burnt some of them or whatever. You know, it has kind of a story that's right out of a CIA handbook of what the story would be. And so you can certainly have a lot of doubts about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then their provenance after that, you know, that they were given, they were put in the custody of a group of Dominican priests who promptly began to sit on them and not translate them and not disseminate them for over 40 years. So like all these scholars are drooling over these things. They want to get their hands on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and these Catholic priests wouldn't give them up for 40 years. Robert Eisenman was actually at the forefront of basically liberating these documents by resorting to legal action to get them put out. But we're reading from his book here that is called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. Qumran is the location the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and the Maccabees were a generation of, a dynasty of Jewish leaders, or a dynasty of Jewish kings from the 2nd and 1st century BC that basically liberated Judea for that period of time between the time of the Greeks and the time of the Romans. And then the Zadokites comes all the way down from Zadok, the priest of high priest under David and Solomon, and then his heirs. But it also means righteousness, as in the teacher of righteousness. Okay, now Eisenman is difficult reading. Get what you can get. Maybe chalk up other things to maybe I'll figure this out later. Just like a lot of ancient texts and ancient writings, you kind of have to use the detective approach. I get one clue here, I get one clue there. I add up a bunch of clues, maybe I can turn them into a bigger clue. It's not a linear type of approach where you just are, you read something and you get it. It's more complicated than that. And we're just kind of combing the surface of Eisenman also. We're not even looking at the footnotes. And I'm leaving out many of the parentheticals just for clarity's sake. Maybe one day down the road we'll go over this document again and we'll go into the footnotes when we're advanced enough for that. I myself am not advanced enough for that, and I'm guessing that most viewers are not going to be either. This is a book mainly for like specialists, and probably if you're a specialist, you probably already recognize that. You've already turned this off because you're like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So, okay. Herod, as would any clever monarch interested in undermining his position, brings in leaders from outside, most notably Hillel from Babylonia and Simon, undermining his opposition. Sorry, I think I might have said undermining his position. Herod, as would any clever monarch interested in undermining his opposition, brings in leaders from outside, most notably Hillel from Babylonia and Simon ben Boethus from Egypt. The establishment which he sponsors and creates, partially by confiscating the wealth of the previous one, which had been destroyed, much as its central figures, the members of the Maccabean family themselves, had been destroyed. Now Herod comes in 37 BC. This is kind of like at the end of the Maccabees. Pompey, under the Romans, basically came into Judea in 63 BC. And so for that period, 63 to 37, it was somewhat fluid as to who was going to be taking control there. But it was eventually Herod. Herod was of a dynasty, the Herodians. Herod the Great, he was the first, although he did have his father Antipater was also a player, but they were basically the puppet kings of Judea. They were puppets of the Romans. Okay, so they were sponsored by the Romans, but they had some probably Maccabean blood, or definitely some type of Jewish blood, but they were really puppets of the Romans. And then he gives birth to a bunch of other rulers that we've heard about from the New Testament, like Philip and Antipas and Agrippa. These are all Herods. So the establishment which he sponsors and creates, partially by confiscating the wealth, is the Pharisaic, Sadducean one so familiar to us from portraits in the New Testament and also Josephus. With the appearance of the Zealot movement in 4 BC, coincident with Herod's own demise, and that's when Herod's rule came to an end in 4 BC. Coincident with Herod's own demise, habitation at Qumran revives, as the coin distribution verifies. So he was arguing that Qumran declined about this time that Herod took over, and then when Herod died, Qumran revived itself. Now, a lot of scholars believe that Qumran declined in 31 BC as a result of the earthquake that occurred there. He's disputing that, really. But this movement is more than just zealot, as Josephus so pejoratively designates it, to conceal its other tendencies after the election of Phannius and the killing of Ananus and other high priests in the last stages of the uprising. The terminology is also picked up and applied in the New Testament, not to others, but to followers of Jesus. A better description of it would be messianic, as it is marked by a series of messianic pretenders, from the shepherd Anthroges and Judas in 4 BC to the Egyptian for whom Paul is mistaken, Menachem ben Judas, and Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba is the revolter from 2nd century, 132 to 135 revolt, that finally basically put an end to the Jewish revolts in Judea and basically scattered all the Jews. It is messianic because it believes the time of the end or the last days is at hand, and that the Messiah of Israel must arise. It is often overlooked how messianic the Qumran sect actually was, and what one is not just speaking here about the well-known notion of the two messiahs, which has been widely commented on, presumably because it is so perplexing. Rather, what is even more striking is the reference to and quotation of the all-important star prophecy from Numbers 24:17 upwards of 3 times in the extant corpus, once in the Damascus document, once in the War Scroll, and at least once in what should be called the sect's messianic proof texts. Now, this star prophecy is super interesting. It just basically means it's supposed to be reserved for Jews. But Josephus talks about it. He gave the star prophecy to Vespasian, the Roman emperor, said that I prophesy that one day you will become the new emperor. And Josephus said this when he was surrendering to Vespasian, and he eventually he had the idea that the Romans, God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans and then gave Vespasian the star prophecy. When Vespasian actually did become emperor, Vespasian pardoned him and brought him to Rome as one of the court historians and adopted him as a member of his family, put him up in the palace. And the same thing happened with Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is the founder of the rabbinic school of Judaism. He gave Vespasian the star prophecy also, although that might have been Titus, but one of the two of them, he gave them the star prophecy, and he was rewarded with a land grant from the Caesars in order to start this campus for the study of the Old Testament scriptures, which eventually becomes the Talmud and the start of rabbinic Judaism. And Herod was given the star prophecy also by the Essenes. So now let's see what Eisenman has to say about it. Josephus, in a rare moment of candor, describes this prophecy as the moving force behind the whole of the uprising against Rome, the signal for the actual start of which was the halting of sacrifice in the temple by the zealous lower priests. Examples and reflections of the currency of this prophecy is in the 1st century AD and beyond can be seen in Josephus's and in our Yohanan ben Zakkai's derisive misuse of it, that is, improperly applying it to a Roman conqueror Vespasian, behavior akin to the supposed jeering by the Jewish crowd at the Messiah Jesus crowned by thorns, and further afield in the peculiar twists given it in the infancy narrative of the star over Bethlehem in Matthew's Gospel, and in the name accorded Bar Kosiba by tradition, the son of the star. One might add to this the obvious game being played by Tiberius Alexander, Philo's nephew, and a good buddy of Titus's, Titus's kind of a lieutenant. Tiberius Alexander, and one of the richest people in the Roman Empire. Tiberius Alexander, Philo's nephew, to convince Vespasian that he was indeed the Messiah, called from Palestine to rule the world. This is to say nothing of Agrippa I's seeming possession by it, and his posturing in silver garments, in all probability to invoke the stars' glitter before a theater crowd in Caesarea prior to his suspiciously sudden death. And so this star prophecy is quite important, and he's going to focus on this, I think, a little bit. I had another point to bring up here. Well, the minor point that you probably know that I just want to bring up is that Vespasian and Titus, among three other Roman emperors, were literally deified by the Roman Senate, okay, so after their deaths. So these Caesars, this is Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and Claudius Caesar, in addition to Vespasian and Titus, they were literally gods, okay? So when you think of the fact that they wrote the New Testament, it's not a stretch. You know, they literally thought of themselves as gods, and they were by law gods. So, you know, don't think that this is just like coming out of no place. Okay, let's see if we have time to read one more paragraph here. We'll try one more. A succession of priestly Zadokites had already been in existence for a century or two before the official appearance of this so-called zealot movement, to identify at least four so indicated in the extant literature: Simeon, Onias, Judas, and Honi. This sequence is, strictly speaking, anterior to the Messianic. It undergoes a Messianic transformation once the Maccabean family, the last properly Zadokite line, is finally destroyed. Then a new variation of it is invoked for priestly and secular legitimacy. This is what Josephus is at pains to conceal in his zealot theorizing. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Take over at this location tomorrow. Please come back. Meanwhile, like, share, subscribe, and comment. And also, have a beautiful night.